There is something nobody tells you about the strongest people you will ever encounter. They don't announce themselves. On a Saturday morning in September, Officer Darren Pryce pulled over a black man on a road in Atlanta. The man was in full United States Navy dress uniform. Every decoration 16 years of service can earn. Fallujah, 3 deployments, things this country asked him to do in places this country will never fully explain, was on his chest. Pryce looked at all of it. He put the handcuffs on anyway. And here is the part that nobody in that zip code, nobody in that department, nobody who would later sit in a conference room watching the body camera footage could explain or look away from. That man said nothing. He called nobody. Not because he couldn't. Not because he was afraid. Because Cordell Teal had spent 16 years learning the difference between the men who react and the men who win. And he had learned something else, something his mother gave him long before the Navy ever found him, that his silence was not emptiness, it was a weapon. And he already knew exactly where he was going to use it. If you've ever had to be twice as careful, twice as composed, twice as documented just to be treated like you belong, this channel is built for you. Like this video. Subscribe. And stay, because what Cordell did next, and how he did it, is the whole story. Darren Pryce had been on shift for 3 hours when he turned onto the road. The radio was on low. The morning was the kind of quiet that experienced officers know not to trust, not because something was coming, but because quiet had a texture in this zip code that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the hour. By 10, it would be different. At 8:42, it was just a road, and a man who had been driving it for 14 months and knew its patterns the way you know the patterns of anything you have repeated long enough that the repetition becomes instinct. That was the word for what had happened to Darren Pryce over 14 months. Not corruption, not cruelty, instinct. Captain Tasker's memo had not arrived as an instruction he memorized. It had arrived as a reorientation, gradual, cumulative, the kind that happens not through one decision, but through 100 small ones that each feel unremarkable in the moment. Heightened enforcement presence in 3 zip codes. He had understood what heightened meant, the way you understand a thing that is demonstrated rather than explained, through his evaluation metrics, through the overtime allocation, through the quiet, consistent signal of what made a good month look different from a bad one on a paycheck. Nobody had told him who to stop. The system had simply made clear what stopping looked like when you were doing it right. 14 months of that signal teaches a man things the policy manual never names, because the policy manual is not where the real curriculum lives. He saw no violation when he pulled behind Cordell's car. He knew this. It was not a thought he was suppressing. It was a fact he had processed and moved past without ceremony, the way you move past anything that the system around you has reclassified as irrelevant. The car was in the zip code. The driver matched the profile. The threshold for what constituted sufficient cause had been moving for 14 months, one shift at a time, and Pryce no longer remembered precisely where it had started, because you cannot feel a threshold moving when you are the one moving with it. He activated his lights. He pulled up behind the car and stepped out and walked toward the driver's window, the way he had walked toward hundreds of driver's windows in 8 years. Professionally, with the practiced economy of movement that training gives you and repetition keeps sharp. He was already forming the language of the stop in his mind. He was already in the procedural sequence. Then he reached the window and saw the uniform. The chapter turns here. Not because Pryce had a moment of conscience. He did not. Not yet. Not for weeks. But because something entered his processing that his processing had no prepared response for. The uniform. The decorations. Every insignia on the chest of the man behind the wheel earned across 16 years of service, in places that demanded the specific kind of composure Pryce was now standing 3 feet away from, and not recognizing for what it was. He had a range of responses he had been trained to manage: agitation, compliance, fear, deflection. He had categories for all of it. He knew what to do with all of it. What he was receiving from the man in the driver's seat was none of it. It was something else, a quality of stillness that wasn't submission and wasn't aggression and wasn't performance of any kind he could name. It was complete. It was unreadable. And in the specific vocabulary of a man who had spent 8 years learning to read stops, unreadable registered as threat before it registered as anything else. He ran the name. Clean return. He stood at the window looking at the screen, and then at the uniform, and then at the face of the man wearing it, who was looking back at him with the same quality of nothing. Not defiant, nothing. Not afraid, nothing. Simply the nothing of a man who had decided something before the lights came on and was executing that decision without visible effort. He asked Cordell to step out. Cordell stepped out. I left the car. It traveled with him. It left the car. It traveled with him. It stood on the side of the road with him. It gave Pryce nothing to respond to and nothing to document and nothing to point at. He put the handcuffs on. He drove away. And somewhere below the part of him that was still running the procedural sequence, still completing the morning the way the morning was supposed to complete, something quieter had started. He would not find a name for it for weeks. It was the specific unease of a man who has done something he cannot explain. Not to an attorney, not to a review board, and not to himself on a Tuesday morning when the footage is everywhere and the name is in every headline, and he is sitting with the memory of a clean return on a screen, and a uniform he looked at, and a man he gave nothing back to. He gave me nothing. The whole time. Nothing I could use. What happened after the patrol car left that road is documented in the department's own records. The following is what those records show. 9:34 a.m. Subject arrives at processing. Full dress uniform. Decorations present and cataloged on intake log. 16 years of service, itemized in a column beside a case number. 9:41 a.m. Strip search ordered. Supervisor authorization. None documented. Reasonable suspicion of weapons or contraband. None recorded. Department policy for a misdemeanor pedestrian charge is cite and release. A strip search is not cite and release. The order was given anyway. 9:43 a.m. Subject's dress uniform removed. Placed in a property bin. Every decoration. Every insignia. On every commendation earned across 16 years of service in places this country sent him and has never fully explained. In a bin. In a building. On a Saturday morning in September. 9:52 a.m. Standard processing completed. Subject eligible for cite and release under department policy. Time elapsed since arrival. 18 minutes. Maximum policy guideline for processing. 2 hours. Standard guideline. 45 minutes. The processing is complete. The subject is not released. 11:22 a.m. First water request. Logged by the booking officer on duty. Notation in the record. Deferred pending processing completion. Processing had been completed 90 minutes earlier. The request was not deferred. It was denied. Those are not the same word. 12:47 p.m. Second water request. Logged. Same notation. Deferred pending processing completion. A man held in a cell for a misdemeanor pedestrian citation has now requested water twice. Both requests are in the building's own record. Both are marked deferred. Neither has been fulfilled. 2:11 p.m. Property log notes. 2 service decorations not located in subject's bin. Location? Unconfirmed. At this moment, 2 decorations belonging to a 16-year Navy combat veteran, earned in places and circumstances that most of the people in this building will never be asked to survive, are somewhere in the building. Not where they were put, not accounted for. Somewhere. 4:14 p.m. 6 hours and 40 minutes after he arrived. Subject released on own recognizance. Total hold time, 6 hours, 40 minutes. The charge, misdemeanor pedestrian citation. Cite and release eligible since 9:52 a.m. Time held beyond the policy maximum, 4 hours, 40 minutes. No documentation of the delay exists in the record. No supervisor authorization for extended holding exists in the record. No explanation was ever written in the log beside the numbers. The numbers simply sit there, the way numbers sit when no one expected them to be read by anyone who would understand what they meant. 4:18 p.m. 2 missing decorations located in a separate property tray, returned to subjected vehicle. 4 hours after they went unaccounted for. Returned at a vehicle in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon to a man who had said nothing for 6 hours and 40 minutes and was not going to start now. The department's own cameras and logs recorded all of it, every timestamp, and every unanswered request, every missing item. They recorded it the way institutions record things, without judgment, without explanation, as pure administrative fact. The building did not know it was building a case. It was simply doing what buildings do: logging, storing, preserving. The footage fell under mandatory chain of custody protocol, 90-day minimum retention. No deletion request was ever filed, because Pryce had no reason to believe this stop would become anything other than what every other stop had become: processed, absorbed, forgotten. He was wrong about that. The timestamps speak. Cordell says nothing. The building expected reaction and received nothing, so it kept going. And the record of what it did across 6 hours and 40 minutes, in a man's silence, in the department's own handwriting, that became the most damning document in the case, not because someone found it, because no one thought to hide it. Lemuel Odom was not supposed to be on that road. He was supposed to have left 15 minutes earlier, which would have put him at his dry cleaning shop on Edgewood before the delivery truck arrived at 9. He had not left 15 minutes earlier because he had gone back inside for his phone charger, which meant he was now 3 cars back at a red light on a Saturday morning, running the math on whether the truck would wait or whether he'd be calling the driver again, when Pryce's lights came on 200 feet ahead of him. He registered the stop the way you register anything that happens outside your windshield when you are thinking about something else. Peripherally, without real attention. Traffic stop. Road backing up. He would be later than he already was. He was thinking about the delivery. Then the light changed, and the car in front of him pulled forward, and Lemuel pulled forward, and he saw the uniform. He has tried, in the months since, to describe what happened in the next few seconds, in terms that are precise enough to be honest. It was not surprise. Surprise would have meant that somewhere in him was an assumption that this was not possible, that a black man in a Navy dress uniform on a road in Atlanta was not a person the system would stop and handcuff on a Saturday morning. Lemuel Odom had lived in Atlanta for 31 years. He did not have that assumption. What he felt was not surprise. It was something older than surprise, a grief that had been sitting in a room for a long time and had just found the door. He reached for his phone. He did not decide to. His hand moved before the decision arrived, and for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. His for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. His hands did not shake. He will be asked about this in the deposition, about the steadiness, about whether he had prepared to film, as if steadiness requires a prior intention, as if the composure required to film a wrongful arrest is somehow more remarkable than the composure required to endure one. He will answer the way he answers everything in that room, directly, without reaching beyond what he knows to be true. He was steady because he was watching something that required him to pay attention. That is all. What he saw was this: Cordell stepping out of the vehicle with his hands already visible before Pryce finished the sentence asking him to show them. Cordell answering questions in the specific economy of a man who gives exactly what is asked and nothing else. 3 words, where 3 words are sufficient. Silence, where silence is sufficient. Cordell standing on the shoulder of that road, while Pryce moved behind him, and the quality of how he stood, not stiff, not performing, not bracing, just present, completely present, in the way that very few people are completely present under pressure, because complete presence under pressure is something most people have to be trained for across years of conditions Lemuel could not fully imagine. And then Cordell's face when the cuffs went on. Not a flinch. Not a reaction. Not a single thing given to the moment that the moment had not earned. But he looked at the road ahead of him with the stillness of a man who had made a decision before any of this started, and was simply continuing to execute it. Lemuel kept the camera on his face because he could not look away from it, because he had never seen anything like it on a road in Atlanta, and understood, without being able to name it yet, that he was watching something that mattered. The patrol car drove away. Lemuel sat in his car on the empty road with his phone in his hand, and the footage saved in 3 places. He had backed it up without thinking. The way you do something that your body has already decided is important. He was looking at the place on the shoulder where Cordell had been standing. He was thinking about the uniform, about what it takes to wear it, not about what it costs to stand in it on the side of a road while someone puts handcuffs on you and give that person absolutely nothing. No reaction, no collapse, no evidence that what was being done to you had found a way in. He posted the footage 17 minutes later. He did not write a caption. There was nothing to write. The footage said what he had watched, and what he had watched said everything that needed to be said. He was 40 minutes late to his shop. The delivery driver had waited. He didn't say a word. Not one word. Not one. I kept waiting for him to say something, and he just... nothing. Willa Greer had been processing bookings for 19 years, and she had learned, somewhere around year 4, that the job required a specific kind of detachment. Not coldness, not indifference, but the professional distance of a person who understands that her feelings about what she is processing are not the point. The point is the processing. Correct. Thorough. Consistent. The same care for every person who came through, regardless of what she thought about the charges, or the officer who filed them, or the machinery that had produced both. She had maintained that detachment through 19 years, and hundreds of bookings, and 11 specific moments where something in the paperwork made her feel a thing she had learned to set aside until she was no longer on the clock. Cordell Teal was the 12th. She received the file at 4:16 on a Saturday afternoon. She read the charges first: pedestrian interference, resisting. And then she read the name. And then she looked up at the man standing in front of her booking desk in a full United States Navy dress uniform, every decoration present, 16 years of service on his chest, and she felt the thing she had felt 11 times before, and had learned not to show, and had learned, more importantly, to pay attention to. She processed him exactly as procedure required. She did not move faster or slower than she would have moved for anyone else. She did not make eye contact longer than the job required, or ask questions that were not on the form, or give any indication of anything beyond the professional competence she had been bringing to this desk for 19 years. Every form completed. Every box filled. Correct and thorough. Then she went to the copy machine. She copied the booking report, the body camera footage log, the processing room timestamps, all of them, the full 6 hours and 40 minutes of them, the water requests, and the notation that said deferred, when deferred was not the accurate word. The property log with the notation about the decorations that had been somewhere in the building and not where they were put for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon. The stop record, the original citation. She made 1 copy for the file, which was where procedure required it. She made 2 copies for her personal locker, which was where 19 years of paying attention required them. She had a folder in that locker. She had started it in year 6 with a piece of paperwork she could not stop thinking about, and had added to it carefully, deliberately, over the 13 years since. 11 documents before today, not because she was building toward anything, not because she had a plan or an attorney contact or a vision of the moment when the folder would matter, because she was the kind of woman who understood, at a level that did not require explanation, that some paperwork needs to exist in more than one place, that institutions have a way of losing things that are inconvenient and finding things that are useful, and that the difference between those two outcomes sometimes comes down to whether one person at one copy machine decided the document was worth the paper. She put Cordell's paperwork in the folder. She locked the locker. On time. Not without care, but without the time. Not without care, but without the performance of care, which is its own form of respect. She asked. Cordell looked at her, and he said, with the same quality of composure she had been watching since he arrived, complete, unhurried, taking exactly the amount of space the answer required and not one syllable more. He said, "No, thank you." 2 words, courtesy and tact, giving nothing that wasn't asked for and everything that common decency requires on a Saturday afternoon in a booking room after 6 hours and 40 minutes in a cell for crossing a street against the light. She wrote the answer in the official record. And that evening, in her own notebook, the one she kept separate from anything the department could access or audit or review, she wrote it again. Not the case number, not the charges, just what she had seen and what he had said. Full dress uniform, 16 years of service. No thank you. She closed the notebook. She went home. In 19 years, she had never processed a man who said so little and gave her so much to think about. Prescott Burrell had a habit, developed over 22 years in the city attorney's office, of reading difficult letters standing up. He had started doing it without intention. Some early case where the news was bad, and he had paced while reading, and found that the movement helped him think. And it had become the kind of habit you do not notice until someone points it out, which a paralegal had done once and which he had not changed. He stood at the window of his office on Tuesday morning, Atlanta below him going about its business, and he read Beverly Sharp's letter from the first line to the last without stopping. He did not finish it before he understood, but he finished it anyway. That was the habit, too. He set it on the windowsill. He looked at the city for a moment. Then he picked the letter back up and read it again. Because 22 years had taught him that the cost of a thing and the arrival of a thing are 2 separate events, and that the space between reading and understanding is where careful men do their most important work. He had built the $3 million threshold in 2019. The audience needed to understand this correctly. He had not built it with bad faith. Bad faith would have been simpler, would have had a shape he could recognize and condemn. What he had built it with was the specific, practiced good faith of a man who asks the question his role requires him to ask, what can the city absorb? And receives an answer from people he trusts and works with that answer without pulling at the threads underneath it. He had set the threshold $400,000 below the number he was given, which was the kind of conservative margin that 22 years of careful practice had taught him to build in. He had signed the document, he had dated it, he had filed it, and not thought about it again because it had done what he designed it to do, which was to hold, and it had held. And 11 settlements later, the mathematics had continued to confirm that the design was sound. He stood at the window and understood, for the first time, what the mathematics had been confirming. Not that the system was working, that the system was working at the wrong thing. He had not asked who was being stopped. He had not asked what the demographic breakdown of 18 months of heightened enforcement presence looked like when you put it in a column and read it. He had not asked to see Tasker's memo, had not known it existed, which was not the same as it not existing, and the law did not recognize that distinction, and neither would a jury. He had not asked what logic lived underneath the consultant's zip code, mapping beyond the demographic profile that produced it. He had asked what the city could afford. He had received a number. He had built a threshold. And the threshold had worked for 11 cases, because 11 cases had been priced into the design. They were not failures of the system. They were the system. The settlements were the system absorbing its own cost at exactly the level where absorption was cheaper than change, and the cost had been calculated, and the calculation had been correct, and he had signed it. He became aware that his hand, holding the letter, had tightened without his noticing. He loosened it. He looked down at the paper. His own signature was on the threshold document. He could see it in his mind, the way you see things you have handled enough times that the memory of them is physical. The exact weight of the pen, the particular way his name looked when he wrote it quickly, which was how he had written it on a document he had not expected to become evidence. Discovery would not ask for the questions he had not asked. It would answer them. Every document he had not requested was sitting in the city's own servers right now, producible, waiting. The consultant's report, Tasker's memo, the processing room timestamps, the property log with a 4-hour window and 2 missing Navy service decorations, and his threshold document, his signature, his calculation, his margin, demonstrating in his own handwriting that the city had possessed sufficient awareness of the pattern to construct a financial instrument calibrated specifically to survive it. That was the third liability category. That was the number with no ceiling. He set the letter on the windowsill again. He looked at Atlanta for one more moment, the city he had been protecting, he had believed, for 22 years. The city going about its Tuesday morning below him, unaware that 14 floors up, a man was standing with a letter in his hand, understanding that he had protected the city through 11 cases and into the 12th, and that the 12th was the one his protection had been building toward all along. He picked up the phone. He called the mayor's chief of staff. While it rang, he moved away from the window and sat down at his desk for the first time all morning, the way a man sits when he is done standing. The footage was everywhere before he finished the first paragraph. There was no version of this that ended quietly. Commander Alistair Vance did not call ahead. He had seen the footage on Saturday afternoon through a staff member who had sent it with no message attached. Just the link, because no message was necessary, because 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a man in full Navy dress uniform being handcuffed on the side of a road in Atlanta said everything a message would have said, and said it more clearly. Vance had watched it once. He had not called Cordell. He had checked the flight schedule. There are moments in a commanding officer's life when the phone is the wrong instrument, when what the moment requires is not a voice through a speaker, but a presence at a table. Vance had been leading men long enough to know the difference between the moments that needed words and the moments that needed someone to get on a plane. This was the second kind, and he drove from the airport to Rosette Teal's house on a Sunday morning and knocked on the door, and she opened it the way mothers open doors when they have been expecting someone. Not because he had called, but because she knew her son, and she knew the people her son trusted, and she understood that this particular Sunday wasn't a Sunday when Cordell would be left alone by the people who knew what he was. Cordell was at the kitchen table, civilian clothes, eating the breakfast Rosette had made because it was what she knew how to do, and what she knew how to do was never small. It was eggs and biscuits and coffee, and the specific abundance of a mother who understands that food is not food. It is the physical form of I am here, and you are home, and nothing that happened to you out there has changed what you are in this kitchen. Vance sat down. Rosette put coffee in front of him without asking. He thanked her. He drank it. He did not ask Cordell how he was. He knew how he was. He had sent this man into places where how he was afterward was not the relevant question. The relevant question was always, what did you do, and did you do it right, and are you ready to go back? Cordell had always answered the same way, completely, without embellishment, without reaching for anything beyond what was true. What Vance could tell the audience about Cordell Teal across 16 years of service was this, not symbolically, specifically. He had sent Cordell into environments where the margin between the right decision and the wrong one was measured in seconds, and the cost of the wrong one was measured in lives. Not his own life only. The lives of the men beside him, and the men depending on him, the men who came home because Cordell made the right call in the dark in a place this country sent him and has never fully explained. Vance had trusted Cordell with irreplaceable things, the word irreplaceable used precisely meaning things that could not be replaced, meaning human beings. And Cordell had carried that trust across 3 deployments and 16 years without once giving Vance a reason to recalibrate it. That was what the uniform represented, not symbolically, specifically. Vance set down his coffee cup. He asked the only question he had flown to Atlanta to ask. He said, "What did you say to him?" Cordell looked at him across the kitchen table, the same look he had given Pryce on the road, the same look he had given the booking room, the same complete and unhurried quality of presence that gave nothing it hadn't been asked for. He said, "Nothing he didn't ask me first." Vance nodded. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He was thinking, though he did not say it, because Vance was a man who said the things that needed saying and left the rest in the room where they belonged. That he had spent 16 years training Cordell Teal to give nothing to people trying to take something. That the composure Pryce had stood in front of on the side of a road and could not name and could not manage and could not explain in a deposition room was the most disciplined response in Cordell's entire repertoire. That what had looked like passivity to a man running a quota system in a zip code was the output of 16 years of the most demanding preparation this country offers. The Navy had given Cordell many things. What he had used on that road, Vance understood sitting in Rosette's kitchen on a Sunday morning with coffee and biscuits and the light coming through the window, was something she had given him first. "I've trusted this man with things I can't name in this room. He stood on the side of a road in Atlanta and did what we trained for. He gave them nothing they could use." Beverly Sharp watched the footage twice before she called anyone. The first time she watched it as a person. She let it run from the beginning. Lemuel's steady hand, the road, the uniform, the handcuffs. And she felt what any person with a working conscience feels watching 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a decorated Navy veteran being placed in restraints on a public street for crossing against a light. She felt it completely. She gave it the full weight it deserved. And then she rewound it to the beginning and watched it a second time as an attorney. The 2 viewings produced the same conclusion by different routes. She had been practicing civil rights law for 24 years. She had taken cases against this specific department for 6 of them, 11 cases, 6 years. And she knew the threshold, had known it, since the year Prescott Burrell filed it, had understood immediately what it was designed to do, and had spent 6 years working inside the design, because the design was the reality, and the reality was what her clients had to live inside regardless of whether it was just. 11 settlements, $2.1 million across 11 cases, each one calibrated carefully enough to stay below the number that would have triggered mandatory reform. She had won 11 times. She had changed nothing 11 times. And she had understood, going into each of those cases, that winning was not the same as changing, that the system was working exactly as designed, and that her victories were part of the design because they were priced into it. She had taken the cases anyway, because her clients deserved someone who knew the room, because winning something was not the same as winning nothing, because she had believed, going into each one, that the next case might be the one the mathematics could not absorb. She had been right. It had just taken 11 cases to get here. She opened the processing room record. She read it the way she had learned to read documents that were going to matter, slowly, without skipping, giving each line the specific attention it deserved before moving to the next one. The strip search order, no supervisor authorization, no documented reasonable suspicion. A misdemeanor pedestrian citation producing a strip search that department policy did not sanction, and that no one had bothered to justify in writing because justification had not previously been required. The timestamps are 9:52 a.m. eligible for release, 4:14 p.m. actually released, 6 hours and 40 minutes with nothing in the log beside the numbers. No explanation, no authorization, no record of any human decision that could account for the gap. The water requests, both of them. The notation that said deferred when what it meant was denied, and the difference between those 2 words was the difference between an oversight and a civil rights violation. The property log. A 4-hour window. 2 service decorations. Unaccounted for. She set the record down. She had the footage. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Hands visible before he was asked. A face that gave the camera nothing a jury could misread. A uniform that would be in every frame of every exhibit for the duration of any trial. She had the systemic pattern. 847 stops, on 79%. Tasker's memo, Prescott's threshold document. That was already enough. That was already more than enough to break the ceiling that 11 cases had never broken. But the processing room record was different from all of it. The footage showed what one officer did on one road. The record showed what the building did afterward, what multiple people across multiple hours decided, or failed to decide, or decided not to decide, in the documented presence of a man who had said nothing and given them nothing, and whom they had held for 6 hours and 40 minutes anyway. That was not individual misconduct. That was a pattern of institutional behavior documented in the institution's own handwriting, indefensible in front of a jury, unexplainable across 18 months of litigation. Iron worth more in a settlement room than anything she had walked in with across 11 previous cases combined. This was not the 11th case. This was what the 11 cases had been built to protect. She picked up the phone. She called the number she had for Cordell through a mutual contact. He answered on the second ring. She made her case in 3 sentences: the footage, the record, the threshold. And she did not soften any of it because he was not a man who needed softening, and she was not an attorney who offered it. He said, "When can you start?" She said, "I already did. 11 cases, 11 settlements. The city calculated the cost of each one and decided it was worth it. This one they couldn't calculate. The uniform was in every frame. And what they did after the uniform came off is in their own records." Rosette Teal did not ask her son how he was. She knew how he was. She had known how he was before he walked through the door, before the footage was everywhere, before the phone started ringing with numbers she didn't recognize, and she stopped answering it. She had known how he was because she had made him who he was, and the woman who makes a person knows that person at a depth that no arrest, no booking room, no 6 hours and 40 minutes in a cell can reach. She made breakfast. Eggs. Biscuits. The same breakfast she had been making in this kitchen for 31 years of Sunday mornings and weekday mornings, and the particular kind of morning that follows a day that should not have happened. She put it in front of him. She sat across from him. She watched him eat. She had been a 3rd-grade teacher in Atlanta public schools for 31 years. She had taught children to read in a city that did not always make it easy to be the kind of child she was teaching. Black children, most of them, growing up in a city that would ask more of their composure than it was ever willing to acknowledge or reward. She had understood her job to be larger than reading. Reading was the instrument. What she was actually teaching was the arc, the understanding that what a child carries out of a classroom does not stay in the classroom, that it travels with them into every room they will ever stand in, and that the quality of what they carry determines the quality of what they can do when the room becomes difficult. She had raised Cordell the same way she had taught, with patience, with precision, with the long view. Her mind moved through memory the way it always moved, not by date, not by sequence, but by meaning. She thought about her mother, Cora. Cora had been a deacon's wife at Ebenezer Baptist for 40 years, a woman who had lived through things that Rosette knew only through the telling, who had carried herself through all of it with a quality of composure that Rosette had absorbed before she had language for it. Cora had sat Rosette down when Rosette was 8 years old and said in the specific voice she used when she was giving something that was meant to last, "The loudest person in the room is usually the one who's already lost." Rosette had carried it for 56 years. She had given it to Cordell. She thought about the kitchen table. This same table, different chairs. Cordell at 12 years old, to home from school with the specific anger of a 12-year-old black boy in Atlanta who has encountered something unjust and has nowhere to put it, which is a justified anger, which is an anger that has accurate information about the world, which is the kind of anger that needs not to be extinguished, but to be given direction. She had sat across from him the way she was sitting now. She had said, "Your silence is not weakness. It is intelligence. Do not give anyone the satisfaction of your reaction. Make them sit in what they did." She had not known she was preparing him for a Saturday morning in a Navy dress uniform at 38. She had been preparing him for the world as she understood it, which was the world as Cora gave it to her, which was the world as Cora's mother gave it to Cora. So an inheritance passed through 3 generations of black women in this family who had understood something about power and restraint and the specific weapon of composure long before the law was ever willing to confirm what they knew. Composure is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision about what your feeling is for. Cordell looked up from his plate. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across this table since he was 12 years old, directly, without performance, giving her exactly what was true and nothing more. He said quietly, without drama, the way he said everything, "I knew what I was doing, Mama. The whole time. I knew." Rosette looked at her son. She did not say, "I know you did." She did not say, "I raised you to." She did not say anything. Because she was her son's mother, and he was her mother's grandson. And in this family, silence had always meant more than words could hold. "I love you, and I am proud of you. And I knew before you did. And you were always going to be fine." She let the silence say it. The church had given this family many things across 3 generations. But this precise understanding of what silence is for, this knowledge that composure is not what you do when you have no other choice, but what you do when you have chosen the most powerful option available. This had come from Cora, and then from Rosette, and then from a kitchen table in Atlanta, where a woman told a 12-year-old boy something his grandmother had told her, something her grandmother had told Cora, and something that had traveled through 3 generations of women who understood it before any of them had a legal vocabulary to explain why it was true. He had been sitting in his mother's kitchen at 38, and he had just made an entire city sit in what it did for 6 hours and 40 minutes. Make them sit in what they did. They were sitting. The deposition took place on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta. The room had a long table, 6 chairs, a screen on the far wall, and a court reporter at the end, whose job was to record everything and express nothing. She had been doing this work for 16 years. She was very good at it. Present, Officer Pryce and his union attorney, Beverly Sharp, and 2 attorneys from Prescott Burrell's office. And on the screen, waiting, the 2 pieces of footage that had been produced in Discovery and that everyone in the room had already watched, and that no one in the room was going to be able to explain away. Beverly Sharp asked Pryce to watch both. His union attorney did not object. There was nothing to object to. The footage existed. It had been produced legally. It showed what it showed. Objecting to watching it in a conference room would not change what it showed. The union attorney understood this. He had understood it since the moment he read the Discovery production, and had spent the 2 weeks between then and now understanding it in increasing detail. Pryce watched. He watched himself follow Cordell's car for 3 blocks on a Saturday morning in September, without a visible violation. The dashcam catching his patrol car from behind, the distance between them constant, no signal activated, no infraction occurring in front of him. He watched himself pull up behind the car when he finally did activate the lights, and he watched himself get out and walk toward the driver's window with the professional economy of a man running a stop he had run hundreds of times. Then the window, then the uniform, his own face on the screen, caught by his own dashcam from an angle he had not known was recording. The half-second of something moving behind his eyes, something registering and then being set aside, something that did not change what his hands did next. He watched himself run the name. He watched himself read the screen. He watched himself look from the screen to the window and back to the screen and put the handcuffs on anyway. Beverly let the first footage run to its end. Then she opened the second. Pryce had not been in the processing room. He had filed his paperwork and gone back on shift because that was the procedure, and he had followed the procedure, and he had not thought about what the building did with the man he left there because the building was not his department once the paperwork was filed. He understood now, watching the processing room camera on a screen on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta, that the building had cameras the same way the road had cameras, that the building had been recording the same way the road had been recording, that everything done inside it to a man who gave it nothing in return was in the department's own record, on the department's own servers, produced in Discovery the same as everything else. The strip search order, the uniform coming off, every decoration, every insignia, a bin. Beverly let it run. Then she asked her questions, each one delivered without inflection, without editorial, without the performance of outrage that would have given Pryce something to push against. Each one a door opened at a measured pace, one after another, and each one walked through. At the time you applied restraints, had the subject made any aggressive movement? No. Had he failed to comply with any instruction? No. Had the record return indicated any prior history of violence or outstanding warrants? No. What was your documented basis for physical restraint? The room waited. Pryce looked at the frozen image on the screen, Cordell on the shoulder of the road, hands visible, dressed uniform, face turned toward a point in the middle distance, with the complete and unnerving stillness of a man who had made a decision before any of this started and was simply continuing to execute it. Pryce said, "I felt the situation required it." Beverly did not respond. She did not redirect. She did not follow up. She let the answer sit in the room exactly where he had placed it, next to the footage, next to the timestamps, next to the 6 hours and 40 minutes, next to the bin with the uniform in it. And she let Darren Pryce sit in the room with his own words and everything his own words could not explain. She said, "No further questions. The city settled 14 days later. He gave me nothing I could use. That was the whole problem. I couldn't explain what I was responding to because there was nothing to respond to. There was just him." The settlement was $14 million, the largest single civil rights settlement in the department's history, $11.9 million more than any previous case had produced, more than 5 times the threshold Prescott Burrell had built in 2019 to make sure no single case ever reached the number that would require the city to change. The threshold had held for 11 cases. The 12th had not asked for permission. The mandatory reform provision required 3 things the department had never been required to do: independent review of all stop and identify incidents within 30 days of filing, an external audit of all departmental enforcement directives, including any documents referencing zip code-based patrol priorities, which meant Tasker's memo was now subject to public records requests, and anyone who wanted to read it could. A public quarterly report on the demographic breakdown of all misdemeanor stops. The things that had been designed to be invisible were required, for the first time, to be seen. Captain Glenn Tasker retired 3 weeks before the audit began. He gave no interviews. He had nothing to say that the memo had not already said. Officer Darren Pryce did not lose his job. He was not the machine. He had been the machine's instrument, and instruments get restructured when the machine does. New supervisory framework, new evaluation metrics, a department that now published its stop demographics to a public that could read them every quarter. Whether he understood what the restructuring meant and why it existed, and whose silence had made it necessary, was not something the settlement could require of him. That understanding was his own work to do. Sergeant Willa Greer was not recognized in any official capacity. She did not ask to be. Her copies became part of the evidentiary record. She made 3 more and put them in a different drawer. She went back to work on Monday morning, the way she had gone to work every Monday morning for 19 years. She intends to continue. Lemuel Odom does not think of himself as the person who changed anything. He thinks of himself as the person who was running late on a Saturday morning and reached for his phone. He's right on both counts. His dry cleaning shop received 4 minutes and 11 seconds of attention it never asked for, and he remains, to this day, a man who was running late. A Beverly Sharp is already in discovery on the next case. And Cordell Teal, on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, put on his dress uniform. He checked every decoration in the mirror with the precise attention of a man who has done this for 16 years and intends to do it for 16 more. He drove to the naval station. He did his work. He came home. The uniform hangs in his closet between trips. Full dress. Every decoration in place. It does not hang there as a wound. It does not hang there as a monument or a symbol or a reminder of what was done to him on a road in Atlanta on a Saturday morning in September. It hangs there because it is his. Because he earned it across 16 years in places this country sent him and has never fully explained. Because it was on his chest when a man looked at everything it represented and decided it didn't matter. And Cordell stood on the side of that road and gave that man nothing. No reaction, no collapse, no gift of his composure to a system that had been running for 14 months on the precise assumption that people like him had no composure left to give. He had been saving it. He knew exactly what it was for. He said nothing. He called nobody. He didn't have to. If you've ever watched someone survive something they never should have had to face and felt it somewhere deep because you know exactly what that costs, this channel is built for you. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to know these stories exist. This is just the beginning. There is so much more coming.